I'm Jono Buchanan. Through the last few episodes, what we've done is to begin to take our knowledge of the individual steps of a scale and to apply those to chords and to learn how chords fit together within particular musical keys. But at the moment, what we've basically done is I've explained all of that sort of on the piano. And that's fine, and it's all well and good. But actually what we're interested in doing is to see how all of this music theory might relate to the sort of music we actually want to make. And obviously all of us are making music in different forms and different genres for different purposes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a chord progression and we're going to see what happens when we apply that to a number of different musical styles. Now what we're going to do is we're going to keep things really simple, just so we can from that point sort of extrapolate outwards and to begin to see how music then meets sound design to produce the productions that we want to begin to make. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work in the key of D major. And what I want to do is to use just 4 chords, and they're going to be D, G, which is chord 4, chord 6, which is B minor, and chord 5, which is A major. So in the scale of D major, that's the 6th step, so that's chord 6 is going to be B minor. In D major, the 4th step is G, so that's going to be G major. And the 5th chord is A major. Now, what we've done in a previous video is to look at the idea of working with inversions. This idea that we can play every single chord in its root position, which sounds a bit strange, or what we can do is to start thinking about chords in different ways. And what I'm going to do with my D major is to make it a first inversion chord. And what that does is to give us this really interesting poised sense that what we want to do next is to go to G major in root position from this kind of little springboard of the F sharp. So I'm going to go from 1 to 4, but I'm going to go via 1 first inversion. And then what I'm going to do is to move up to my chord 6 and down to 5. Now, if I keep playing this sequence round and round, it's fine. But what we're not really getting is any sort of sense of where the melody might emerge out of these chords. They sound like chords supporting something else. Now, this then brings us on to this idea of what we refer to as voice leading. Where do we want a melody to emerge from, supported by the chords that we're playing? And to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to strip everything back and make it unbelievably straightforward. I'm just going to play 2 notes for each individual chord. So at the moment, if this is our D major, and we're playing it as a first inversion, what I'm going to do for a moment is to get rid of the D. And then we've got G major, up to B minor and down to A major. So we've got our chords kind of implied by the 3rd sitting on top of each individual chord. Okay, now the only difference is this first chord. So the 3rd would be the F sharp, but I'm playing that in the bass. So I'm moving everything up 1 inversion step. Okay, so that's the little shape that we've got emerging. Now, as I said, there's no real melody that's emerging out of this. So what we can do is to start thinking about a tune based on those chords that might emerge from the foundation of the chords that we're playing. So you can see that what I can start doing is thinking, okay, well in my left hand, I'm going to keep playing the chords that I want. I've obviously resolved down to the D right at the end. But what I'm starting to do is to think about different inversions that could play to pick out a little bit more of a melody. Now, what does that look like when we start putting back in the middle note again? So I can just keep improvising around different melodic shapes, thinking about how tunes might emerge out of the shapes that we're building. So just based on those 4 chords, what I can start doing is thinking, okay, I might need to go slowly, but what I'm going to do is to just pick apart each chord and work out how I want to string different things together. So here are 4 different musical examples, all based around that same chord progression. And what I've done this time is to kind of imagine them all as different things. So this first one is more like a kind of film scorey, slightly adverty treatment of this particular collection of chords for piano and a synth pad. Okay, so there's a sort of quite beautiful crystalline version of exactly that chord progression, sort of playing at half speed, I guess. And what I've done is obviously to take the whole thing up here. And reverb helps too. Okay, let's have a look at our second treatment. So this is much more of a sort of string arrangement version of the same thing. What I've got is 3 main string voices, cellos, violas, and second violins. And in the second half, we've got a single note arriving in the first violins, nice and high, and the double basses playing the same thing as the cellos. Again, all the same chord progression. Now, if we have a look at the MIDI for these 3 middle parts for this particular interpretation, let's get rid of all the MIDI draw for a moment. So I'm just looking at all of the MIDI and to see how it actually sort of unfolds. You can see that what I've actually done here is to create a suspension. Now, we talked about suspensions in the previous episode. So this moment here where this resolves, this chord goes back to D major at this point, what I've done is to keep the B in the G chord lasting over the moment where it resolves to D. Let's just run this from here for a moment. So in this particular more kind of stately version of this chord progression for this string arrangement, I've had just a little moment there where I've decided to suspend the resolution of that chord so it doesn't arrive with everything else. Again, it's a kind of voice leading technique, and it just gives a different spin to this idea of exactly the same chords. But once again, it's the same progression. So how might this sort of sound for a more singer-songwritery guitar-based version? Well, more like this, I guess. Okay, so there's kind of Fireside mix version of the same chords. Again, exactly the same things, nice big open chords, strum guitar and some bass and some drums, but exactly the same chord progression and maybe a more sort of pop sort of context to finish. Really, again, the same chords, different treatment again. So remember, that's 4 different interpretations of exactly the same chord progression. And this is where music theory starts to come to life. Because suddenly what we're doing is we're combining what we know of how chords fit together with sound design, the tempo that we want to work at, the sounds we want to work with. And effectively what we're doing is we're starting to unlock the production process, having built the sonic foundation for our tracks. Now, so far, what we've done is to sort of deliberately limit ourselves to chords around a particular key and the chords that relate to that key. So whether or not we're dealing with kind of C major and the idea of what the chords are that fit with C major, or whether we're taking a minor chord and looking at, or a minor scale and looking at the chords which fit with that, so far that's kind of where we've gone. But the thing about unlocking music theory is we can almost take a note and to think about all of the ways in which that note can belong. So let's take the note C for a moment. Here's my C. Okay, so where does C fit? Well, we know that it's the root position of C major. We know that it's the 5th of F major. We know that it's a sus 4-3, a suspended 4-3 in a G major chord. It could be the 3rd in an A flat major chord. It could be the 6th in a C minor chord first inversion. It could be the 7th in a D flat major 7. There are all these places it can exist, including in an F sharp diminished. Okay, so the interesting thing is that I could write a chord progression which just keeps a C going no matter what else I do. Now, that's a slightly odd chord progression, but nevertheless, effectively what we've got is this idea of a C existing throughout what we do. And this allows us to produce what's called a pivot chord. So this idea of chords that have one note in common from one to the next. So using C as a pivot, if I wanted to, this would be strange, but I can try it. I could go from C major to, let's say, D7. And back to C major. So this sounds a little bit superhero-ish to me. It sounds like a kind of launch pad for a theme that might emerge and sort of spring upwards from that point. Similarly, we could do something like this. So what we're doing here is we're moving from C major to C minor first inversion, keeping our C at the top. So effectively, what we could do would be to say to ourselves, right, can we write a chord progression which just keeps one note playing the whole time? And this is a really interesting little test that you can start playing when you're beginning to experiment with music theory, is to sort of say, okay, well, what I want to do is to sort of say, okay, I don't want to just jump from one place randomly to another. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin my chord progression around one note, and to make sure that for a while that note exists in every single chord. And what that's going to do is to unlock some really unusual chords for you and potentially some really interesting moves. Radiohead love that idea. They regularly write songs which keep one note just banging away as the chords shift up and down underneath what's happening on top. And that's a really beautiful way of just being able to write some really unusual chords with some really interesting colours in them. So what we've done over the last few episodes is to basically take an extremely sort of start point understanding of music theory, and we've taken it a long way in a short period of time. So just to summarize, we started by learning the C major scale and the C minor scale. We learned that each step for any scale is effectively separated by whole tones or semitones, and we learned that those patterns are different from major and minor scales. What we then did was to realize that scales lead to chords, 1, 3, and 5. Those 3 notes of any chord will give you a major chord or a minor chord. And what we learned is that if we keep within a particular scale, then the chords stem from those. Each note of the scale can trigger its own chord, which will make musical sense in the context of any given scale. But we also learned that so long as we keep those steps the same, It doesn't matter what note we start on, the key of an individual song doesn't really matter. The notes of its scales and its chords are the thing that make it feel like they belong to a particular key. So having learnt those, what we've started doing is to experiment now with different chord progressions. And we've learnt that the same sorts of progressions can turn up in all sorts of different types of music. We've just heard 4 interpretations of the same chord progression. But we've also learnt that effectively what we can do is we can make chords more interesting by doing certain things to them. So we've learnt a little bit about inversions, the idea of getting away from a root position chord and playing a chord which has got a different bass note at the bottom, and that lends a completely different quality to each of the chords that we play. And we've also started learning a little bit about voice leading, where the individual notes of a chord go in order for them to feel musical and natural. So we don't have to just keep the same sort of 3-note shape jumping from one chord to another. What we can do is to begin to spread those chords out and to make sure that each voice within a chord is leading to the right note that we want to play next. Most importantly though, we've kind of learned that we can break the rules, that whilst there are some established rules around music theory, so long as what we're doing sounds good and it feels rich and full and interesting, who cares whether or not it absolutely conforms to kind of music theory practice? What's most important is that you're writing the music and that the music that you're writing is as interesting as it can possibly be. But perhaps most importantly, we've discovered that we can add colour in all kinds of ways, whether that means using suspensions, whether it means keeping a note in a chord even when it sort of doesn't belong there, or having a chord that extends the kind of harmonic shape either with maybe a 9 or a 7 to add a colour that suddenly goes beyond the kind of diatonic 3-note chord harmony that we hear so much. So this has been a whistle-stop tour across a few videos just to begin to take our knowledge from the beginning through to a place where hopefully, whether it means you have to take the tempo down of your project or draw notes into a grid, you're nevertheless just starting to think, okay, well maybe what I could do would be to make my chords more interesting by colouring them in different ways and adding new notes and just experimenting with new patterns of notes to produce the pieces of music that you really want to write.